So good afternoon. My name is Sherman Henry. I'm a career faculty member at the University of Oregon Labor Education and Research Center. I'm glad that you all have decided to join us. I want to introduce Nikki Rudiger and Jennifer Smith, who will be monitoring your activities in the chat room so we can have some real-time engagement and answer your questions in each section instead of waiting for the end. So Nikki and Jennifer will be with us. This is the next phase of our racial justice series. The intersection of racial justice and worker advocacy is based on a multi-purposeful view of advocacy and activism, where we explore the intersection of race, workers' rights, and community in the interest of social justice through historical and contemporary issues in our current political climate that is so galvanized by our current occupants of the White House and the Senate and in political discourse. Workers are at a political and economic crossroad. We know that workers have experienced the Wisconsin Act 10 tragedy where they have had their workers' rights reduced for collective bargaining. We know recently with the Janus decision, there's a all-out war on groups like labor organizations and workers' rights. And now that we are experiencing the triple threat of the coronavirus, we're finding having a discussion about essential workers and the political economy of labor through right-wing populism is very important as we are now entering a phase in our democracy or our republic, depending on your perspective, that will shape the future in our current advocacy. We've been experiencing protests in places like Portland for over 100 days. We've been experiencing violence like no other time in my lifetime, but it's not new when we think in terms of the political economy, civil rights movement, women's movement, labor movement, where we've faced these type of challenges, but never in the history that we've faced such overt racism from our federal government and the leadership who continues to push a very extreme agenda in society. And it has mobilized white supremacist groups throughout this country. So this afternoon, we have Bill Fletcher and Joe Lowndes, who are experts in understanding and their scholarship shapes and investigate white supremacy through content, through actual engagement. And so we're gonna call on Bill and Joe to help us think through labor's response through labor education and research, and how we organize counter actions against what we see as a very dangerous movement that would ultimately turn back the hands of time regarding the progress we've made in the last 50 years. And so Joe and Bill, I would ask at the beginning of this discussion, after Jennifer administer a quick poll, we want to kind of take the pulse of those who decided to join us this evening. So Jennifer, is it possible you can administer the quick poll question that we have of the audience?
Yes, I'll launch that poll now. There it comes.
I don't know why I'm on mute.
right, I'll give it another minute. If you haven't voted yet, go ahead and do so. And I'm going to close the poll now. And here are the results.
Good. So 74% of you who participated in the poll believe that both racial perspective and inequality prioritize your politics. So that this is a good outcome for our discussion this evening. So I'll ask Joe and Bill, how do you describe or give us some perspective of right-wing populism and kind of defining it and shaping its relevance to our current crisis?
Who do you want to speak first? Sure.
You can go, Joe. I mean, Bill.
Okay, well, thank you, Sherman, and the university. And to all of you on the West Coast, my hearts and thoughts are with you, and hoping that this catastrophe is brought to a close very soon. Quickly, I look at right-wing populism, and I always start with this as the herpes of capitalism, that it's a virus in the capitalist system. It's a virus that surfaces and resurfaces depending on the kind of crisis that's going on in the rest of the system. And particularly when there's an economic crisis or a fiscal crisis, we see right-wing populism emerge, which therefore begs the question, well, what is it? It is a racist, sexist, xenophobic, irrationalist movement, very authoritarian, both in terms of its structure as well as its objectives, that seeks the future in the past, that it shapes itself, and I'm not just talking about US right-wing populism. Right-wing populism is a global phenomenon, seeks the future in the past. It seeks a mythical past to focus the grievances of the people, because that's where the populism comes in, the notion of the people versus an elite. But it defines the people usually in religious or ethno-nationalist terms. So it focuses their anger and resentments and fears on the possibility of reclaiming a past that may or may not have existed, but a past that can be brought to the imagination of the people. And so in that sense, it's very irrationalist. And in the United States, I would add to that, and you saw it also in Germany between the two world wars, this notion of revanchism, that is this intense politics of revenge, of getting back what was allegedly stolen or lost. And in the case of the United States, right-wing populist, revanchist views are rooted in white supremacy and a notion that, frankly, it doesn't pay to be white anymore, and that what it meant to be a white person has been taken away, and this must be regained in one form or another.
Great, thank you. Joe, same question.
I think Bill pretty much covered it, but I would say I would want to contrast it with left-wing populism is maybe another way into this, which is to say that, both share this idea of the people, right, and an idea of popular sovereignty, and that people ought to be governing their own destinies and ruling their own destinies, and that they're continually threatened by elites who exploit them, who stand in their way. For right-wing populists, as Bill said, the enemies are people above. They might be economic elites or political elites, although those can be defined all kinds of ways, right? They can be globalists or Jews or corporations or whatever. The threats are also people seen to be below you, dependents, parasites. In the United States, it's immigrants, people of color, women, Native people historically. or threats from the outside. Again, immigrants, other countries, in a nationalist view, kind of like you might have, right-wing populists would view China as a rival and a threat. But also forms of internal subversion. The idea that it's a counter-subversive movement, which is always looking for internal subversives and enemies within. And it is, as Bill said, it's always ultimately racist and masculinist, patriarchal, and authoritarian. But it doesn't always, the ways it gets exhibited can be really different. So, open white supremacists, like at Charlottesville, for instance, or people like Dylan Roof, don't get populist, credibility because they're not seen to be generally speaking on behalf of the people. But current right-wing populists can avoid open language of race and racism, but still get there through authoritarian politics of saying that they want to, impose law and order, or they want to protect American workers from, from outside bloodsuckers. And so, it gets, I think there's complications here to all this stuff, but I think we're at a moment where around the world you see forms of left-wing populism, mostly Latin America and Southern Europe, and you see forms of right-wing populism, which are strong in the U.S., Western Europe, Central Europe, now Northern Europe, and they want different things. But but in each case, it's the idea of people determining their own destiny, depending on how how it gets defined.
Sure. Great answer. And so in your book, Joe, your book, Producers, Parasite, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. You've met with some of these members of the Patriot players and Proud Boys, I assume. And right now we're seeing a lot of protests and violence in the street. What role does white supremacy as a movement contribute to the crisis in the workplace, if you would, because of their anti-state, which ultimately transform into an anti-public employee on some level, cause grave concern with what we're seeing now in the law and rulings out of the courts?
Well, partly the since the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, public sector unions, began to be described by people on the right, by neoliberal elites, but other right-wing actors as as welfare queens, right? As people who were like stealing from taxpayers, people who were like with easy jobs, living off the public dole, and that they needed to be brought to account for this kind of stuff. This was, federal workers, state workers, county workers. And, that had credibility, not with just the Republicans, but Democratic governors in a lot of states. And partly, part of what happened was that, I think in Wisconsin, Ohio, and other places here in Oregon, a lot of these white workers weren't sure how to respond because they had never been in a position of being called the parasites before. They had not. That was a position that's occupied historically by people of color in this country. And so, you see people, and I remember Dan Hosang, my co-author, pointing out a sign in the Wisconsin protest that said, "First they came for the teachers." And the problem with that is it wasn't the teachers they came for first. You were down in line further, and they finally came for teachers. But part of it is not really having a clear way, I think, to think about what it means. The American labor movement, elements of it have been in a different place in terms of complicated politics of race around this. But I just say quickly about these far right groups. One thing that was extraordinary at the beginning of the summer is to see these armed Power Boys, Patriot, Prayer People, 3%ers, Oath Keepers coming out in the street to demand to reopen the economy. And here you have armed people. It's the only country where you would have armed people coming out and demand to be sent back to work, right? Instead of going after the bosses or demanding that they shouldn't be working or demanding that there ought to be some other arrangements, they demanded to be sent back to work. And that was the ethic there. It was a freedom depended actually on kind of a viewpoint where workers were only free and only liberated if they were working. So, they also have a vision of economic equality, and they have also a vision of economic freedom. It happens to be one that's deeply both racialized through anti-Black racism, also through kind of in the West Coast or in the Northwest, particularly kind of a settler colonial idea of independence and autonomy. And that stuff functions around, even this last week, we've got armed militia checkpoints all over the state looking for, Antifa people with, with gas cans. And who are they stopping? Not surprising, people of color, right, in these towns. But so there's a lot of complicated stuff, I think, going on in that question and also on the ground.
Sure, no, I agree. Jennifer, just want to do a quick check-in to see if there's any activities happening in the chat room.
Well, we have just one clarifying question, but I do welcome everyone to post their questions in the chat, and periodically Sherman will ask me to see if there's any. But Teresa was asking, Joe, when did you say this reputation of state workers as parasites, quote unquote, happened? Or when did it kind of start, did you say?
Well, it goes way back. I mean, if you look at, if you can see it in William Sumner Graham's Forgotten Man stuff in the late 19th century, right? You see it, there's recurring themes to this through American history. The right-wing think tanks and anti-union groups who wanted to launch this as kind of like right-to-work politics and anti-union politics started really developing this discourse pretty strongly in the early 70s. Gordon Layford at LERC has done a lot of work on this. But it really doesn't, it's one thing for groups and organizations and think tanks to generate ideas and generate talking points. It's another thing when they actually get traction on the ground. And it was really after the Great Recession and the emergence of the Tea Party movement that this stuff really starts getting, widespread, traction. You see it in political cartoons, you see it on Saturday Night Live skits, in a way that actually it's always kind of racialized, even when it's, often it's like kind of like be an attack on Karen Lewis in the Chicago Teachers Union, and then kind of broadly out to all public workers. Or a Saturday Night Live skit, which starts out with a disgruntled Black DMV worker, and then spreads out to be like, making fun of all state workers. And so this really did it to great effect in a lot of state referenda around that time after, Wisconsin, Ohio, Oregon, a bunch of places, and Democratic governors like in New York, Democratic governor here in Oregon, using this kind of language to, public sector workers as really as sponges on the taxpayer. Really, I think like got more traction then anyway, I think.
Sure, thank you.
Can I offer a slightly different point of view?
Yes, go ahead.
Joe, I think it actually began earlier. First of all, the United States has a long tradition of both anti-intellectualism and also a kind of a myth of the rugged individual that has put people in constant tension with government. And I think we saw this certainly in the Depression and fights about the expansion of the government. But if you leave that as sort of a backdrop, when public service becomes more and more desegregated, the public sector is more open for attack by the right. It's like I like to say that old expression, those who the gods will destroy, they first make mad. I say those are the gods will destroy in the United States, they first colorize. And when you do that, then you can move against all kinds of institutions the way Reagan did quite successfully by colorizing public sector and planting in the seed in the heads of a lot of white people that the public sector was really there to protect colored people. And so I hear what you're saying. It's not that I disagree. I would just move the clock back a little bit.
Very, very important point. Joe, you have any follow-up to that?
No, that's really true. I mean, it's even during, as as Bill said, during the New Deal, when white workers were, in the CCC and WPA, no politicians would touch that. But by 39, 40, white workers were starting to cycle out of that into other kinds of employment. There was a moment when these things got really attacked because Black workers started being cycled into these programs, and that's even as far back as that. These it's become points of vulnerability, and of course they do, like Bill says, is it's within deep strains of American ideology, which are there. So I think Bill's right about all this.
Sure, and this is in the face of growing inequality and violence. This shift, which is what Bill is pointing out and you're agreeing, has its roots in a neoliberal creation of a major crisis for working people across all racialized groups. And when we think about the majority of workers and union members, how do we strategically counter right-wing populism and the mobilization that we see around Antifa or around anti-union sentiment in this country? Bill?
I think it's a combination, Sherman, of a practice of anti-racism and education that is internal education that is anti-racist. The in the union movement, just recently, in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, there's a number of unions that have issued very good and courageous statements against the murder and in solidarity with the people in the streets. The problem is, if those same unions don't have a history of either internal anti-racist education as well as a practice around racial justice, there is a pushback within the ranks from right-wing elements that view these kind of statements as antithetical to what trade unionism is supposed to be. And who basically argue, why is the union doing this? That's not what the union should be doing. And when you have unions that haven't, that's a problem. And I almost always talk about the history of the packing house workers, which I think was a great legacy of a union that actively fought racist discrimination in the workplaces, in the communities, in the hiring practices, et cetera, and built a very strong reputation and built unity within its ranks. Unfortunately, we don't have enough unions that have done that. So they are completely open to right-wing populism. I don't mean open in the sense that they're accepting it. What I mean is they're open to being infected by it. And we've seen that over the years. For example, on trade issues, when the union movement has focused almost exclusively on trade as being the source of the degradation of the US working class, and then along comes Trump, and he talks about trade. And then we find ourselves perplexed, right, about why are members supporting him, right? And members will say, well, he's saying what you guys said. Well, not exactly, but I understand what they mean. So I think we have to have an anti-racist practice and anti-racist education in order to beat back the right. But it's got to be more than that, because as Joe and I were both saying, it's not just right-wing populism is not just racist. It is sexist, it's xenophobic, it's incredibly irrationalist. And we've got to take these on. It's anti-science.
Sure, no, I appreciate that. And Joe, in your book, you kind of outline and building from Bill's conversation, how these groups, extreme groups, have now taken the platform of what is associated with civil rights causes and made them causes of their own. Can you elaborate a bit for us on the connection of how these groups' message have now created this belief, as Bill say, that we're saying the same thing and we're fighting the same cause? So for an example, police brutality. right? We know that a lot of their content and speech is around police, and it's a very significant issue now. And I know because of your book that defunding public services in certain communities, especially in the Pacific Northwest, has allowed space for them to grow and normalize their perspective on defunding government or the anti-government rhetoric. How do you see
Yeah,
that?
I mean, it's some of it is like some of it's anti-government and some's not, and some's racist and some's not, you know, and partly it's tracking how the stuff gets expressed. So like, you know, as many people here know, in Southern and Eastern Oregon, you've got whole areas where there's no 911 service. There's almost no law enforcement at all. There's no public libraries are shut down. It's really like, you know, parts of, you know, Josephine County or Douglas County operate like a failed state in some ways. In some of those areas, militias in the last, you know, decade have moved in to cover some of the work of being first responders, of offering classes in small animal butchering, pouring cement for wheelchair ramps for veterans, and taking over this kind of role of state authority in these spaces. You know, which is partly like we've seen with the fires in this last week. These militias are, you know, they're taking on a vigilante role, and so it's not so much, you know, it goes actually hand in hand with policing. This Blue Lives Matter thing is deeply connected to these vigilante groups, which have grown like crazy over the summer, because there's a law and order politics behind it, which is deeply racialized. But the complicated thing here is that you've got like groups like Patriot Prayer in Portland. The leadership is not white, right? Joey Gibson, half Japanese, and says that he's not white. Tiny Toesi, you know, Samoan. He's like Joey's number 2. And the Proud Boys generally, they'll front multiculturalism all the time, but in the service of xenophobia and anti-Islamic politics and masculine violence and all kinds of other things. So some of these things can be shifted around within an authoritarian politics, and that's partly that's partly what we're seeing. And it's also, I think, the reason why Kyle Rittenhouse could suddenly become a hero to mainstream Republicans in a way that someone like Dylan Roof wouldn't be, right? Or James Fields, after he killed Heather Heyer at Charlottesville, couldn't be. Because these militias claim to be guarding the Republic itself, guarding the ideals of the Republic, guarding life and property, without fronting white supremacy. You know, Kyle Rittenhouse can be like the guy who's the shooter is the same kid who's, you know, scrubbing graffiti off walls, and he's a medic and whatever else. And then Tucker Carlson, the president, and other people can say, he's an honest kid just trying to keep the peace and keep order. So it's actually, that's part of the wedge or the opening that these militias have used. If you go to the 3%er website, under their About tab, the first thing they say is, what we are not is white supremacists, and we are not racist, and we are a multiracial organization, which is kind of stunning. This is a little bit different than vigilante violence in the past. It's still authoritarian, and it's still racist and misogynistic and xenophobic, but it presents itself in a different way in a post-civil rights era that we have to probably be very attentive to, right? Because I think that's part of it, what allows it to have broader appeal right now.
Sure, from a public policy perspective and a needs perspective, right? Like when folks feel abandoned by government, then something replaces the role of government, and then they become attached to the cause of this group, and they legitimize this group. So both of you all have made kind of great points about how these groups have kind of legitimized themselves in the public sphere and the debate about democracy. And so it leads to my next question. How can we, as trade unionists, address right-wing populism and its ability to recruit ordinary citizens and workers to a cause that is contrary to their sense of interest? Bill, and I think I asked you this in our last discussion, that we kind of have to figure out how to develop, meaning labor, a message that unites us more than it divides us, as relates to kind of figuring out the interest, because these intersects from a right-wing strategy creates the kind of confusion that you see white union members and other union members joining these groups, whether it's a gun law, anti-abortion law. So how do we think strategically about reshaping our message? Bill?
I think, Sherman, that we have to fight for a politics that says that this is not a white republic. Much like they said in South Africa, the country belongs to the people that are here, and while at the same time we need to repair the damage that this country has done, particularly to the indigenous. I think that we need a labor movement that has the courage to say that working people are being screwed and that the system really is crushing people, and not with an asterisk at the end of that. It's not like it depends on a political party. It depends on the relative power of workers to fight back and to change this. I think that we need a movement that really does have social justice demands at its core. And this is where it gets dicey, because it's not just about wages, hours, and working conditions. It's about, like I was listening to what you were saying, Joe, about the parts of Oregon that have been abandoned. And what I start thinking is warlordism. That when this happens, when the state recedes, what ends up happening is that something fills that gap. And it frequently can be warlords, as we've seen around the world. And so part of our fight really has to be for a reinvigorated public sector, and that people are owed something by the government, and that this needs to be part of the demand of organized labor. So I think that there's several different things that can happen and need to happen immediately in response to this. But again, I go back internal to the ranks of organized labor. We have to have this discussion among our members, and you can't avoid it. You just simply can't. I mean, it's like this issue of law and order. What's driving me crazy, that was so well framed by that coach a couple of weeks ago, is that our people are the ones getting killed. What are white people scared of, right? I mean, we're the ones that are getting killed. So let's talk about when this whole issue of law and order is being raised, what is that about? Those are the discussions we have to have within our ranks.
Sure. Joe, you want to contribute before we go to the chat room?
Yeah, I think what Bill says is right, and part of it is to talk about what it would mean to have, like, actually a workers' rights centered politics as opposed to like a democratic neoliberal politics. When Trump came here, I saw him speak in 2016. He came to the Lane Event Center in Eugene. It's the only place he could do it in Oregon without having a riot. But he gets up there, the first thing he does is read off, someone hands him a list of paper mills that had closed down. And then he reads these off, and then he blames NAFTA and other trade agreements for this. And he's absolutely right. And you can see it in the eyes of, like, out of work timber workers around, right, as they're hearing him say this. And there's something here that's resonating because it feels real. But, it's something that the Democratic Party was, obviously was committed nationally to, the opposite perspective around these things. But it's also then, if you think, it makes me think of another time, Trump speaking at a rally in Minneapolis a few months ago, and he starts blaming Somali immigrants, right? And he's saying these immigrants are, it's like a great replacement theory for him. These people are going to, they're going to destroy America. Democrats are going to let these people in. And the Democratic response is, oh no, you can't be anti-immigrant because that's just racist. You can't talk that way about Somalis because that's racist. But another way to think about that, or to talk about that, would be to say Somali workers are the ones at the front lines of fights there's an Amazon distribution center in Shakopee, just outside Minneapolis. Fights over bathroom breaks and wage increases were being pushed by Somali workers. You know, these the white workers who were hearing Trump in the Target Center in Minneapolis. You know, they've got a lot of anger and resentment, but part of the stuff that because they're getting, you know, they're getting fucked over too. But if you can imagine a politics that wasn't just a moralistic thing around immigration politics, but the idea that maybe these immigrant workers are offering you something, maybe they're showing you something, maybe they're offering a militancy that, you know, that's something that we can all draw from. They're also the ones in Minnesota at the fight at chicken and turkey processing plants on the front lines of that. So there's a way to think about this. It's not just that anti-racism or anti-nativism work, political work and educational work being done in unions and other places is just because it's the right thing to do or just because it's you know, good liberal politics, but everybody's interest is involved in this, right? You know, like an emancipatory politics it's got to be transnational and it's got to be anti-racist because everybody benefits. It's like CLR James said, you know, long ago that you know, the struggles in this country, struggles of people of color have always benefited everybody. And so that's, you know, that's another, just to build kind of on what Bill was saying about what this could actually mean for politics.
Sure. So Jennifer, what's going on in the chat room?
Well, it seems like people are pretty interested in continuing this conversation that Bill and Joe are having about how to develop strategies that might short circuit right-wing populism. And I have a question from two people. I don't know how I can kind of combine them, but
well, let's just ask them separately.
Okay. Well, one is, you know, is it possible that unions, you know, can become more unions are a very democratic unit in our country, but how can they be more like horizontal? And would that horizontalism sort of short circuit some of the decisions that are made by union leadership that might even be counter to workers at some points? And that kind of feeds into a second question that is, there's a real difference in how people conceive of themselves between being a union member and a worker. And workers might feel, you know, more welcomed into a right-wing kind of mindset, while union members, you know, might have more of a social justice perspective. But it's really easy somehow to target unions as being the big bad guy. And can we short circuit that by being more, I don't know, horizontal or more democratic in our unions? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that extremely simple question.
These are complicated times and difficult questions. So Bill or Joe, do you want to try to frame this in a way that the rest of us can kind of appreciate the goal of getting the answer to this?
If I understand the question correctly, I don't think this is mainly about, I don't think if the unions are more horizontal or more vertical, that's going to tackle right-wing populism. There's a term that Joe used in passing that deserves more attention. About replacement and the theory of white genocide, that what's happening in Europe and in North America is that demographic changes combined with neoliberal politics and neoliberal economics, I should say, are leading to an impoverishment of millions of people. And a precarity. The neoliberal economics are leading to the impoverishment, but the migrations and changing demographics are leading to this fear among non-immigrant populations. I don't want to call them indigenous, non-immigrant populations, that their lives are threatened. And the right-wing populist movement seems to have an answer. The fascists clearly have an answer, which are a subset of the right-wing populists. But the right-wing populists seem to have an answer to this precarity, and that your lives will be settled, more comfortable if we put up a wall, if we stop the migrants. Now, among right-wing populists, where it gets really complicated is that out of power, they tend to be anti-neoliberal. In power, they can be both neoliberal and anti-neoliberal. So it gets very complicated. They don't have a coherent economic theory. What's existed in the United States is a willingness of some elements of neoliberal capital to ally with right-wing populists, sort of the way that Dr. Frankenstein imagined aligning with the monster, with the assumption that he could control the monster. Monster can regularly get out of control. And I think that we've seen a lot of that unfold.
So when you say neoliberalism, kind of break that down for some members of the audience who may not necessarily be familiar with the term.
It was the economic response to Keynesian economics that basically argues for deregulation, privatization, casualization of work, the elimination of working class organizations, and in effect, the elimination of any obstacle to the accumulation of profits. It is a recalling of the 19th century. And another term for it that I prefer these days is capitalist fundamentalism. Just because a lot of people get confused in the United States when you use the term neoliberal, in part because we're so used to using the term liberal in a political context, like Ted Kennedy was a liberal, something like that. People get really baffled. I think that a better way of describing it is it's capitalist fundamentalism, as articulated clearly by people like Milton Friedman.
Sure, appreciate that. So Joe, when you think about your body of work and the now white supremacist advocates have kind of taken over the Republican Party, right? In your Washington Post article today, you kind of mentioned that. And they're no longer as moderate as some of the previous leadership. So now that we are experiencing some extreme interpretations or extreme positioning by the current president, how does an ordinary person who is a Republican by tradition address or divorce this current political party philosophy that is also detrimental to workers' rights?
Mm-hmm. Well, partly it's like trying to step back and see what's going on. I think what Bill said about it being an incoherent philosophy is really important. One way to look at it is the way we were talking about this before we started. The social theorist Karl Polanyi said that you have to look at fascist movements as coming from above. There are moments when capitalist class is in crisis and can't manage things on the ground, that they bring in authoritarian strongmen to do that work for them. And here we are, in the midst of the second Gilded Age, the greatest wealth gap in American history, and you've got political instability and economic instability. And so partly the door is open for someone like Trump to come in. Now, what that means for Republicans, I talked to maybe 40 delegates at the Republican convention in 2016 in Cleveland, and you could see people being kind of like uncomfortable with, from across the spectrum, kind of uncomfortable with Trumpism because it felt really extreme at that point in a way that now it seems kind of normal to us, but at that time it was like, whoa, this guy won, what? And so, but a lot of those people kind of like just got on board, and you could see for Republican elites, as long as Trump was willing to get that enormous tax cut passed, they were fine. And the way they did it is that he's going to feed the red meat of like racism and xenophobia and performative cruelty at the border and all this other stuff that allows them to do the work that they want to do. That's how they keep white workers, kind of, if not loyal to the project, then at least not against them in it. So we're kind of in this moment now where the party it's like a Frankenstein's monster in the way that Bill said. The party itself has moved really extremely to the right. If you just looked at Oregon in the last few years, you've got the Multnomah County Republican Party, in Portland, you hiring oath keepers and 3%ers as militia at events. And when the state when there's an en masse, leaving of Republican state legislators from session last year over a cap and trade bill, you had militia people saying that they were going to defend these Republicans against the state police if they tried to bring them back. And then you had Republicans, legislators retweeting these militia threats of violence on state police. You've got a QAnon supporter running against Merkley in the Republican Party for the U.S. Senate. And there's a zillion smaller examples of this throughout the Republican Party, making the state party here something that looks really to the right of like a Central European far-right party, right? And then that's kind of a microcosm of what's happening in the National Party right now, which I think actually puts us on, kind of dangerous footing. I think we're in kind of a moment where mainstream, democratic liberalism is not going to work. We actually are kind of like under threat in a way that's going to require new kinds of responses. We have and part of it was a mass protest in the streets this summer, the biggest in American history, the Black Lives Matter, Black-led multiracial movement. And that actually displaced white militias from the streets who had been out around the pandemic before that. And so, partly what we're going to have is like continued massive social movement activity and new forms of organization and popular power, which is its own kind of populism. I would say Black Lives Matter is a left-wing populist movement, it was kind of like what we're going to need, I think, from our side. And partly is to appeal to people as workers, not as individuals, but as workers. And in a lot of places, people can't be union members. And so there's different kinds of identities. But I think this partly goes back to the poll that you put up right at the beginning. People say, is identity or economic inequality the most important thing? Well, you can't separate those in American politics or anywhere, right? How people think about economic equality is a question of identity, a question of who they think they are and what they think is going to serve those interests. It can't be said, there's no objective space where you've just got economic class issues apart from how people experience these things. White, angry populists are responding to economic conditions through racism, right? And so we have to kind of keep these things kind of like together as we're thinking about them, I think.
Sure, no, I appreciate that. And so, in the sense of trying to balance it out, are we seeing any democratic aspects of extremism or right-wing populism, just as a matter of trying to have a fair and balanced conversation?
Are there left-wing versions? Is that what you?
Yeah. Like what's the example of that when you think about this in terms of not just the Republicans? We understand their challenges for workers' rights and things of that nature, but are we also, in your research, have you discovered where there's some element of that in the Democratic Party?
Sometimes I'll go to rallies and I'll talk to militia people and talk to other people, Proud Boys and whoever. And, I'll also be talking to folks on the other side of the street because those are my actual comrades. But, one side is like armed to the teeth with AR-15s and sidearms and everything else. And with like elaborate imaginations about what they think Black Lives Matter is doing and what Antifa is doing, which is a radically different thing than people, who might be, you could consider them extreme in terms of mainstream American politics, demanding defunding police, demanding a reorganization of municipal government, demanding that American national identity come to terms with its white supremacist past. But, the object isn't violence and revanchism for its own sake, as Bill raised, right? It's about actually transforming, the very basic understandings of what freedom and democracy and equality look like. So I mean, I know I'm a partisan, but I don't think there's anything. If the question of what Antifa is and what it does, mostly it's people actually on computer screens finding ways to out white supremacists and Nazis, right? That's what their work is mostly. That's what Antifa does. It's not like you don't see like armed patrols and checkpoints of like left-wing protesters. It's not, so that would be one thing that would make it different than a Weimar period. There's not like, the left looks very different, I think.
Sure.
Sherman, if I can, I want to jump in a couple things. One is there's a clarifying question that's up in the chat that I wanted to speak to. This person asks, why do the speakers think white private sector workers open to the right, but not state sector workers? I think that the bottom line is because unionization has declined in the private sector. And that as unionization has declined, that has had an impact on the consciousness of private sector workers. I think that the right has been able to say to private sector workers, why should you pay for the benefits of other people, like in the public sector, when you're not getting this? And it becomes sort of a crabs in a barrel phenomenon, rather than private sector workers saying, well, wait a minute, if the public sector has this stuff, we need to have this stuff now too, so let's fight and let's unionize. It's much easier because there's much less danger in terms of attacking other workers. So I think that is one of the factors. The other thing, in terms of your last question, I agree once again with Joe. I don't think that there's any comparable. There are various anarchist trends on the left that I don't think are very helpful right now, and that are not understanding the importance of tactics. But that's very different from what we see on the right. And one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind in the United States is that you don't have to go to Nazi Germany or fascist Italy to find a historical understanding of a lot of what we're facing here. All you have to do is think about the Jim Crow South or the quasi-Jim Crow Southwest and understand how we had in the South one-party rule. We had extrajudicial violence. We had regular voter suppression. And this existed within the larger framework of so-called democratic capitalism. So it, as you know, to paraphrase from the book, it can happen here, in part because it did happen here. And you don't have to wait for stormtroopers in brown uniforms to be walking down the streets to understand that there are various forms of authoritarianism, right-wing authoritarianism. We've experienced some, and here's the punchline. A lot of what was done in the United States was later used by the Nazis and used, in fact, in apartheid South Africa as prototypes. So our history should tell us a lot.
Sure. Thank you. Jennifer, is there any activities in the chat room that you want to report back?
Yeah, there is. Bruce has a question that is really interesting to me as an SEIU 503 member. When the Black Lives Matters rallies were starting after George Floyd's murder, it's very possible I missed it. I'm as plugged in as I possibly can be with my union time and energy, but I was looking for a SEIU 503 contingent to join in the marches, and I didn't see that kind of organization coming through. And Bruce says that there's a Proud Boys rally coming up in a couple of weeks where unions are advocating for a large presence at this rally to counter it. And do you see that as a helpful response?
Joe?
I mean, the thing that generally slows down these, when these far-right groups get onto the street, what really slows them down is to have large numbers of people in opposition, and that's what does it. And Portland can do it, can pull out, thousands of people in response. And I think it becomes even more important to do that now, partly because, if you think about like the larger picture here, so Jay Danielson is killed during that Trump caravan rally. No, so he's killed. And then the alleged killer, Michael Reinl, is killed under maybe dubious circumstances by federal agents a few days later, after Trump, one, has tweeted his condolences to Jay Danielson's family, and then two, tweets that they got to get this cold-blooded killer. And then, 4 SUVs show up and kill Reinl. And maybe they say he fired first, or he had a firearm. There's eyewitnesses have different accounts of that. But then Trump comes out and says, this was retribution. You have to have retribution, right? And so this whole moment in Portland around Patriot Prayer and around anti-fascists has become something that's not just national, but has involved the president directly and federal U.S. Marshals directly. And so Proud Boys marching on September 26th are doing so really fully, in alliance with the U.S. Marshals and Trump. And so there's something here. It's not just like right-wing, left-wing violence in the street. This is something about like an authoritarian regime and its paramilitary wing on the streets. And it's those moments when it seems like it's really important for people to try to show up safely if you can. If it doesn't feel safe, like that's not good. People should stay in the background and do what they need to do to be safe, and they should like figure it out and go with friends and figure it out and talk to a lot of people beforehand before just going. People should be organized and doing this collectively. But it does seem like, I think the idea that if we just ignore these folks, they'll go away is probably, well, historically it's not been true, put it that way.
So I agree, and there has to be a element of counter messaging and counter organizing to mobilize more folks than they are. But there's also a concern with not on the extreme necessarily, but the interpretation of defunding the police, right? And I've been talking to both union members, non-union members, and just ordinary citizens. And it appears that message is not received well, because there is this sense that some groups need the police. Go back to the confusion in messaging as relates to, are we trying to defund the police, or are we trying to reappropriate how the police services are executed in society? So, Bill, I know you weighed in on this defund the police conversation, and it's a populist phrase, right? Defund the police. So can you kind of give us some insight about how you see this matter from a populist perspective, not necessarily right-wing in this case, but from a populist perspective?
Well, I think what's important for people to keep in mind is that the slogan emerged out of a mass movement, out of a spontaneous mass movement. It's not like there was a think tank sitting somewhere and came up with this stuff and then just started popularizing it. And as a result of it coming up from a mass movement, it has many different interpretations. I actually don't use the term. What I talk about is rethink, reallocate, restructure, demilitarize. See, I want to be very clear with people what specific changes need to happen. We need to rethink policing in its entirety. Law enforcement, I don't mean just the city cops, I mean ICE, I mean Border Patrol, I mean about prisons. We need to restructure policing. That, like if you look at the example of the incident in Rochester where the mentally disturbed person was killed, why is the response when there is someone who is mentally challenged for someone to show up with pistols, right? I mean, why is that the response? So we've got to rethink that. We've got to reallocate resources to helping with the real social ills. It's like when you're a hammer, everything is a nail. When you basically take a policing as a response to all the social ills, then the idea is you whack it. And particularly when you create an environment that constantly makes references to wars against crime, wars against drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And then we got to demilitarize. I mean, why do these cops have tanks? Why are they dressed like they're in Baghdad? I mean, it's like, we've got to really rethink that. Now, having said this, Sherman, I'm very clear that a few years ago, my daughter was held up at gunpoint And there was a couple of people that essentially surrounded my daughter and her friends, and she was held up at gunpoint. Now, Sherman, if you would ask me if the guy had gotten shot and killed by the cops, would I have shed a tear? The answer is no. I wouldn't have given a damn what happened to him. Because my attitude is, you pull a gun on an unarmed civilian as an offensive measure, you get what you get. But that was a very specific thing. We have people that have family issues and mental abuse and et cetera. And the response is to deploy these essentially militarized units. That's what we've got to get away from. But masses of people want to make sure they're protected. But they also want to be protected from rogue cops.
Sure, I agree. And so, Joe, when you think about the term defunding the police and the experience that you brought forth earlier about how these militia groups take over police services, what advice as a political scientist would you give us about how to reframe defunding the cops in a way that it becomes less attractive to folks who feel vulnerable when they feel abandoned, if that makes sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bill did a good job of redefining that. One thing we should also remember is it's not like if you're getting held up on the street, it's not like cops are likely to show up and stop that from happening to begin with, right? I mean, the thing is we got to be clear about like what cops actually can do, and sometimes I think there's a little bit. The cops aren't. In their role, they don't show up to stop crimes from happening. They might afterwards follow up, but it's not as if we are fully protected because there are police forces. It's not like crime doesn't happen because we have cops, right? So the question of like what it looks like if you reallocate resources, does crime go up, does crime go down? These are questions that are kind of like open. Now, one complicated question for us here is that police unions are also public sector unions, right? And police unions are like the on the far right edge of U.S. politics in almost every way. And so, and part of these struggles over public sector unions and messaging around it since 2010 was always to say, say cops, firefighters, and nurses, cops, firefighters, and nurses, right? As a way of like, these are the honorable, public sector workers, and we'll put them out front in order to defend other public sector workers. So there's complicated questions here, I think, actually about labor and unions and cops and their role in this as well that I don't have any clear answer to, but it's something that can't be avoided when we're talking about this in a labor context.
Sure, thank you. Jennifer, is there any interesting questions as we get ready to narrow this down the last 10 minutes? Any interesting questions in the chat room?
Interesting. Well, I'm not sure. It might be one that people get as they go about their daily lives in their communities. If you're wearing a Black Lives Matter mask or a hat or a shirt, or have a sign in your window and someone goes, hey, why Black Lives Matter? Why not all lives matter? And I'm wondering if you have a deep or quippy response to that.
So, Joe, how would you respond to the populism of all lives matter while there's a legitimate sense of oppression from those who are constantly feeling the stress of police brutality, or constantly feeling the stress of discrimination when the both parties at some point have not necessarily done a good job, say, for instance, criminal justice. And I mentioned earlier that these right-wing groups take on these causes and try to transform their message to appear reasonable for ordinary people, and it creates kind of some complication or confusion. The line is blurred. So do you have any response to what Jennifer asked?
Yeah, it's just that, I think part of it is to say, obviously, the demand that Black Lives Matter is to say that it's not saying that other lives matter, other lives don't matter, but we have a specific set of conditions here. But I think actually, maybe more deeply than that, it's also the case that Black struggles for freedom, as I said before, every white people benefit as well, right? If you just were to take the prison industrial complex in the U.S., the carceral state, was really built at the expense of Black people and through race baiting and through, Democrats in particular, telling stories about Black crime that made all this possible. But, if you just took the number of white people in prisons in the U.S., we would still have more people in prison per capita by percentage than anybody else in the world, right? So white people also suffer because of these anti-Black measures. White people, are also
That's right.
get killed at the hands of the police, also are in prison. And so part of the reason this is a populist movement, and part of the way this has to be kind of expanded, is to say that these actually struggles, they matter for all of us. I do think all lives matter, and that we shouldn't just dismiss that, because people really do have struggles and suffer and are crushed by capitalism and are abandoned. But how to connect the struggles of people in Josephine County, Oregon, with people in Ferguson or people in Flint, Michigan, has to do with some complicated ways of rethinking people's own sense of independence or connection to one another. And that's not a good or easy answer to this question, unfortunately, but because I think it's a hard one.
No,
Sure.
but let me add to that. See, I think the thing is, Sherman, all lives should matter. All lives don't matter. We're in the United States. The reality is that my life does not matter as far as the larger society is concerned. Ask the family of Castile in Minneapolis whether all lives matter. A guy that has a permit for a gun, who tells the cops that he has a gun, and he gets shot and killed. Yet in that same city, a white woman is killed by the police, and her family gets $20 million now, right? So tell me that all lives matter. It's bullshit, right? That all lives should matter. So if some of these turkeys that are all upset about Black Lives Matter, if they want to wave a flag that says all lives should matter, I'll be under that flag, because that's right. All lives should matter. But wake up and look at the history of this country and tell me if all lives matter. Look at the disproportionate number of Native Americans killed by law enforcement. The greatest percentage, more percentage-wise than African Americans. Nobody's talking about it. So this bull about all lives matter, no. If you believe all lives matter, then go visit a Native American reservation and talk to them about that.
Sure, I appreciate both sentiments. And in our last couple of minutes, based on all of your knowledge and research, let's talk some practical strategies that hopefully can be adopted for the labor movement as we kind of think through the process of anti-racism and addressing the extreme mobilization that we see through right-wing organizing and recruitment. How do we develop a framework, if you would, for galvanizing people of goodwill into to stop what we see as a cancer on our democracy? So, Joe, you want to take a shot at this first?
That's a tall order, Sherman.
Yes. A lot of pancakes, brother.
I think the ethic has to be that people imagine that this, that stuff is, fucked up for them too, right? That they're not, that if you want to enlist, in particular, say white people to broader anti-racist causes, it can't just be through liberal moralism. It has to be through the idea that, like, this system is killing you too. And so you ought to get on board because, this racism is also killing you, and it's not killing you at the same rate and not as fast and not as brutally. You got to be super clear about that. But that, these things, the whole system rests on this. The whole system of, authoritarian control and capitalist, wealth at the top requires these forms of, patriarchy as well as racism in order to exist. So, there's many ways to try to get it actual on the ground organizing or on the ground messages of solidarity and new identifications. But I would say this, I think the right is actually shown that it's really flexible in terms of how it shifts its discourse and its identity in terms of its capaciousness and drawing different kinds of people in, and that we need to be more the same way in terms of like figuring out how to expand, you know, our side.
Sure, Bill.
Well, I want to build on what Joe was saying. I think that it's important for white workers to understand they have a material interest in opposing white supremacy. And that's really hard. But my father used to sum it up really well. He said, if you're going to keep someone in the sewer, you got to stand there on top of the sewer to make sure that they don't escape. And basically, white folks have been on that sewer, making sure that we don't escape, and they ain't going nowhere, white workers. So, and anytime you look at, when you look at the studies, where the strongest racism and white supremacy exists, the living standard for everybody is low. And this is one of the things that people saw for years when you look at the Jim Crow South with right to work. Strong white supremacy, lack of unionization, low living standard. So there's actually a material interest that white workers have, not white people as a whole, but white workers have in an elimination of white supremacy. And that's part of the argument that unions need to make. Also, and very immediately, we need real organization around the election. We need to create brigades of volunteers that are going to help people register, help people vote, show up in mass. We need people protecting the polls. If we have large numbers of people, then folks are not going to be intimidated by either the fascists or by DHS. And we have to be ready to mobilize if Agent Orange in the White House loses the election and chooses to stay. And we've got to make sure that people are prepared to get out there and, let's just say very nicely, convey our concern.
Sure. So in closing, Jennifer, do you want to, we plan to keep this series and conversation going, and out of it, we hope to come out with some tangible strategies and recommendation for the labor movement through our series. So Jennifer, you want to tell them about the next set of panels that we plan so far?
Yes, on September 30th in 2 weeks, also a Wednesday, we are hosting 2 staff members from AFSCME who will be talking about how to interrupt systems of oppression in your unions. And I've just put on in the chat a link to register for that session. It can also be found through our LERC website, which is the second link I shared there. And we welcome you all to share that link widely and to register for that session. And we're recording this this whole series, and we will let you know when they're available on our YouTube channel.
So thank you everyone for attending, and as Bill stated earlier, my thoughts are with folks in Oregon dealing with the fire and all of the air pollution and things of that nature. Bill, Joe, any last minute words of wisdom before we sign off?
I would just say thanks for your great questions, Sherman, and thanks to Jennifer and Michelle for organizing this, and LERC, which is an amazing organization, and I'm proud to share a campus with LERC for being there.
Sure, and both of you guys, but Joe, while you are speaking, give us a way that folks who are interested in your body of work can kind of visit your website.
It's joelowndes.org, one word, and I blog fairly regularly and put up other writings and ways to access other stuff I'm doing. So if anybody wants to check that out, it's or you can subscribe to the blog. It's free, and I just every week or so, kind of track mostly kind of things related to race and right-wing politics and populism, but sometimes other things too.
Same thing, Bill. Give us some parting words of wisdom and a way that folks who are interested in your body of work can visit your website as well.
Thank you. It's BillFletcherJr.com, and Jr. is JR. And also, I'm an executive editor of something called GlobalAfricanWorker.com. And Global African Worker is one word. So I really encourage people to look at that. And my final words are from my Klingon ancestors, who would say kapla, which means forward into victory. Thanks a lot, Sherman. And thanks, Jennifer.
Sure. Thank you all, and good evening, folks. We're going to
Take care.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.